He wasn't supposed to be there. No dog sits in the middle of a cold English road at 4:30 in the morning, holding a baby like it understands what's at stake. The headlights cut through a veil of low-hanging mist, pale and uncertain, stretching across a narrow country lane just outside a quiet village where even the wind seemed to move more carefully. Oliver Hayes had driven this road 100 times, maybe more, after long shifts that blurred into one another, the kind where silence felt heavier than noise. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, knuckles pale from habit rather than tension, the hum of the engine steady beneath him like a distant heartbeat. Then, movement. Not fast, not frantic. Still, too still. His foot slammed the brake before his mind caught up, tires whispering against damp tarmac as the car lurched to a halt just yards away from the shape ahead. For a moment, he didn't breathe. The beam of his headlights settled, revealing it piece by piece like a photograph developing in slow time. A dog. Large. A German shepherd, coat darkened by the damp air, sitting squarely in the center of the road as if it belonged there. And in its mouth, God help him, a bundle. Small. Wrapped in what looked like a worn coat or blanket, edges dragging slightly along the ground. Oliver blinked once, then again, trying to force sense into something that refused to be explained. No, he murmured under his breath, voice barely more than fog against the glass. The dog did not move. It did not flinch under the harsh white light. Its posture was firm, deliberate, almost waiting. The kind of stillness that wasn't fear, but purpose. Oliver's first thought came sharp and instinctive. Something was wrong. Not just unusual. Wrong. He reached for the door handle, hesitated, then pushed it open. Cold air slipped inside the car, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and distant hedgerows, that familiar countryside smell that usually calmed him. Not tonight. His boots met the road with a dull, grounded sound, each step forward measured, cautious, as if the moment might shatter if he moved too quickly. Easy, easy now, he called softly, though he wasn't sure whether. He was speaking to the dog or to himself. The shepherd's ears flicked slightly at the sound of his voice, but it did not retreat. Instead, it adjusted its stance by the smallest margin, lowering its head just enough to steady the bundle it carried. That was when Oliver saw it. The fabric shifted, just a fraction, revealing the tiniest movement beneath. A hand, no bigger than his palm, trembling. His chest tightened so suddenly it felt like something inside him had snapped awake. Bloody hell. The words escaped without permission. He closed the remaining distance slowly, lowering himself instinctively, as if approaching something sacred rather than uncertain. The dog's eyes met his then, amber, clear, and unervingly calm. Not wild, not aggressive. There was something else in them. Something that didn't belong in an animal stranded on a road at dawn. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was intent, as though it had been waiting for him specifically. Oliver swallowed hard, the world narrowing to the space between them. It's all right, he said, softer now, voice steadier than he felt. I'm not going to hurt you. The dog held his gaze for one long second more, then did something that made the air around them feel heavier. It stepped forward. Slow, careful, deliberate. And then, with a gentleness that didn't seem possible, it lowered its head and placed the bundle at Oliver's feet. Not dropped, not released carelessly. Placed, like an offering. Oliver froze, hands hovering midair as if afraid to touch what he might find. The fabric was damp, chilled by the morning air, but when he peeled it back just enough, the truth revealed itself in a single fragile breath, a baby. Tiny, pale from the cold, but breathing. Barely. A faint rise and fall beneath the layers. Alive. Stay with me. Just a little longer, he whispered, though he wasn't sure the words were for the child or himself. Behind him, the engine of his car ticked softly as it cooled, the only other sound in a world that had gone unnaturally still. He gathered the baby carefully into his arms, feeling the slight weight, the fragile warmth struggling against the chill. And for a moment, just a moment, he thought, that was it. That he would carry the child back to the car, drive, find help, and whatever strange thing had happened here would be left behind in the mist like a story no one would quite believe. But when he turned, the dog moved again. Not away, not relieved. It stepped into his path, blocking him, sitting once more in the road, eyes locked on his, as if to say, no, not yet. Oliver did not move at first, not because he could not, but because something in the way the dog held its ground made movement feel like the wrong choice, like stepping out of line in a moment that demanded patience rather than urgency. The baby in his arms gave the faintest sound, not quite a cry, more a fragile breath catching in the cold. An instinct pulled him one way while the silent insistence of the animal pulled him another. He glanced down at the small face tucked within the folds of damp fabric, then back at the shepherd, whose amber eyes did not waver, did not plead in panic, but held steady with a quiet certainty that unsettled him more than fear ever could. "What is it, then?" he said under his breath, voice low, almost respectful, as though he had stepped into something that required understanding rather than control. The dog shifted its weight slightly, then turned its head, just enough to glance toward the hedgerow that lined the narrow road, where shadows gathered thicker and the mist seemed to cling more stubbornly to the earth. It did not run. It did not bark. It simply looked, then looked back at him. Oliver felt the moment stretch, thin and fragile, before something inside him settled into place. He had seen hesitation before, in men on the edge of decisions that changed everything. This felt the same. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than anything else. "I am listening." He adjusted his hold on the baby, tucking the small body closer against his chest to shield it from the cold air, then took a step away from the car instead of toward it. The dog rose immediately, not startled, but ready, as if this had always been the direction they were meant to take. It moved ahead of him at a measured pace, glancing back every few seconds to ensure he followed, never straying too far, never rushing. The road gave way beneath his boots to softer ground as he approached the verge, the scent of damp grass and soil rising stronger now, mingling with the faint chill that settled deeper into his bones. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once, sharp and brief, then fell silent again. Oliver's breath came slow, controlled, the way it had during long nights when every sound mattered. "You are leading me somewhere," he said quietly, watching the dog pause at a narrow gap in the hedgerow, where branches parted just enough for a person to pass through. The shepherd slipped through first, disappearing for a second before its head reappeared on the other side, eyes catching the light just enough to guide him forward. Oliver hesitated only a heartbeat, then followed, brushing past damp leaves that whispered against his jacket. On the other side, the world felt different. The road, with its clean line and steady surface, was gone. Here, the ground dipped slightly, uneven beneath his feet, the grass longer, untouched, bending under the weight of dew. The mist hung lower, thicker, softening the edges of everything until distance became uncertain. The dog moved ahead again, slower now, more deliberate, as though the space itself demanded care. Oliver adjusted his footing, careful not to stumble, his attention divided between the fragile life in his arms and the silent guide before him. "Keep breathing," he whispered, glancing down at the baby, feeling the faint warmth still there, small but stubborn. A few more steps, perhaps 10 yards, maybe less, and then the dog stopped. Not abruptly, but with a quiet finality that made Oliver halt as well. It stood beside a patch of flattened grass, its posture lowering slightly, head dipping towards something just beyond his line of sight. Oliver's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the sense that whatever answer he had been led toward was waiting just ahead. He stepped closer, carefully, each movement slow, respectful, until the shape on the ground came into view. A woman lay there, partially shielded by the tall grass, her coat drawn loosely around her, as though she had tried to keep herself warm through the long hours of the night. Her face was pale in the dim light, strands of hair clinging to her cheek, her breathing shallow but present, a faint rise and fall that mirrored the fragile rhythm of the child in Oliver's arms. For a moment, everything went still. The road behind him, the car, the ordinary world, all of it seemed distant, as though he had stepped into a quiet space held together by something unseen. The dog moved closer to the woman, lowering itself beside her, its body curving protectively along her side without touching too firmly, as if it understood the balance between presence and pressure. Oliver knelt slowly, the damp earth seeping through the fabric of his trousers, and looked between them, the child, the mother, the dog. A single thread connected all three, invisible but undeniable. "You brought the baby out," he said softly, the realization settling in with a weight that was not heavy, but profound. The dog did not react to the words, but its gaze lifted to meet his once more, steady, unwavering. It had not panicked. It had not fled. It had made a choice. Oliver exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something released. He shifted the baby gently, ensuring it remained secure, then reached into his pocket with his free hand, pulling out his phone. The screen lit faintly in the dim morning light, a small, modern glow against the quiet of the field. He glanced at the signal for a fraction of a second, then looked back at the woman, then at the dog. "You did not want me to leave," he murmured. "You needed me to see this." His thumb hovered over the screen, ready to call for help, but for just a second longer, he remained still, caught in the weight of what had unfolded. The dog rested its head lightly against the woman's arm, eyes soft now, no longer searching, no longer urgent. Its task, whatever it had been, was complete. And in that stillness, with the first faint hint of dawn beginning to lighten the mist beyond the hedgerow, Oliver understood something simple and unspoken. This had never been about stopping a car. It had been about choosing the right one. The call connected on the second ring, the faint crackle of early morning signal threading through the quiet field as Oliver pressed the phone closer to his ear, his voice steady but low, carrying the kind of calm that came from knowing panic would only waste time. "Emergency services," he said clearly, eyes fixed on the woman's slow, fragile breathing. "I need assistance on a country lane just outside Weatherby, near the old hedgerow stretch past Millbrook Turn. There is a woman here, unconscious but breathing, and an infant. Both alive, but they need help immediately." The operator's voice came through, composed, asking for details, but Oliver answered almost instinctively. His focus split between speaking and watching, always watching. The baby shifted slightly against his chest, a faint, trembling motion that told him the small body was still fighting, still holding on. He adjusted his grip, tucking the fabric closer around the child, shielding it from the damp chill that lingered in the air. "Stay with me," he whispered again, softer now, more a promise than a command. Beside him, the German shepherd remained still, its body curved protectively near the woman, ears flicking at the distant hum of the waking world, but its gaze never leaving her face for long. It was not restless anymore. It did not pace. It simply stayed, as though it understood that its part had shifted from action to presence. Oliver ended the call with a brief confirmation, slipping the phone back into his pocket as he leaned closer to the woman, careful, measured, respectful. "Can you hear me?" he said gently, his voice carrying no urgency now, only steadiness. There was no immediate response, but her breathing remained, faint and consistent, a quiet rhythm that held everything together. He glanced at the dog, then back at her, noticing the way one of her hands rested loosely against the ground, fingers slightly curled, as if they had been holding on to something not long ago. The dog moved then, just a fraction, lowering its head to rest lightly against her arm, a gesture so deliberate it felt almost human. Oliver exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling into something deeper than tension. Minutes passed, though they felt stretched, elastic, each second carrying more awareness than time usually allowed. The mist began to lift, just barely, thinning at the edges where the first pale hints of morning filtered through. The world beyond the hedgerow stirred, distant sounds returning one by one. The low rumble of a lorry far off, the call of birds growing more certain, more alive. Life continuing, unaware of what had unfolded in this quiet pocket of land. Oliver shifted his position slightly, careful not to disturb the baby, his knees damp from the ground, his breath steady now. He had seen difficult mornings before, moments where decisions mattered, where hesitation cost something. But this felt different. There had been no command, no instruction, no clear path. Only a choice to trust something that could not explain itself. His gaze drifted back to the dog, studying it more closely now in the growing light. Its coat, dark and thick, was marked by the damp, small traces of mud along its legs, signs of distance traveled, effort made without pause. Its eyes, though, remained the same, clear, focused, carrying a quiet intelligence that did not ask for recognition, only understanding. "You carried the baby," Oliver said softly, more statement than question, the realization deepening as he spoke it aloud. The dog's ears flicked once, but it did not move away, did not break its calm. It had done what it needed to do. Nothing more. In the distance, faint at first, then growing, came the sound of sirens. Not loud, not urgent in a way that broke the moment, but present enough to signal that help was on its way. Oliver glanced toward the hedgerow, listening, calculating the distance, then looked back down at the woman and the child. "They are coming," he murmured, as though the words might reach them even in their quiet state. The baby stirred again, a small shift, a breath that came slightly stronger than before, and Oliver felt something in his chest ease, just enough to let hope settle in without fear of breaking. The dog lifted its head at the sound of the approaching vehicles, ears alert now, posture adjusting, but it did not step away from the woman. It stayed exactly where it had been, a silent guardian at her side. Oliver watched it for a moment longer, then reached out slowly, cautiously, giving the animal the space to refuse if it wished. His hand hovered, then rested lightly against the dog's shoulder, a simple contact, steady and calm. The shepherd did not pull away. It accepted the touch without reaction, as though it understood it not as ownership, but as acknowledgement. "You chose well," Oliver said under his breath, his voice carrying a quiet respect that needed no answer. The sirens grew closer now, cutting gently through the morning air as the first emergency vehicle approached the lane, tires slowing as it turned off the main road. Oliver could see the faint flash of blue light through the thinning mist, the world beginning to reconnect with what had happened here. He shifted slightly, preparing to guide them in, to explain, to hand over what had been placed in his care for this brief, fragile stretch of time. But before he moved, he looked once more at the dog, at the woman, at the child in his arms, and understood something that would stay long after the moment passed. Not all rescues begin with a call. Some begin with a choice made in silence, by a soul that cannot speak, and a man willing to listen. The first vehicle came to a careful stop along the narrow lane, tires pressing softly against the damp edge of the road as the engine idled low, its presence respectful rather than disruptive. Blue lights pulsed gently through the thinning mist, not harsh, not overwhelming, just enough to mark the arrival of help without breaking the quiet that still lingered over the field. Oliver rose slightly from where he knelt, one arm steady around the baby, the other lifting just enough to signal his position through the hedgerow. "Over here," he called, voice firm but controlled, carrying across the short distance with clarity. Footsteps followed soon after, measured and purposeful, two paramedics moving through the gap in the hedge with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this many times before, their expressions composed, their movements economical. One of them, a woman in her early 40s with calm eyes and a steady presence, approached Oliver. First, her gaze immediately drawn to the child in his arms. "Let me take a look," she said gently, her tone soft but assured. Oliver nodded and shifted carefully, passing the baby into her hands with a level of care that bordered on reverence. The moment of transfer was brief, but it carried weight, as though something fragile had been entrusted and now passed on without words. The paramedic wrapped the infant more securely, checking breathing, listening, watching, her focus absolute. "Good," she murmured under her breath, almost to herself. "Still with us." The second paramedic moved toward the woman on the ground, kneeling beside her, assessing with quiet precision, his hands steady, his voice low as he spoke into a radio clipped to his jacket. Oliver stepped back just slightly, giving them space, though his eyes remained fixed on the scene, following every small movement, every sign that life continued. The German shepherd did not move away. As the paramedic approached the woman, the dog lifted its head, alert but not aggressive, watching closely, as if weighing the presence of these new arrivals. There was a brief pause, a silent exchange not spoken aloud. Then the animal lowered its gaze again, allowing the man to continue. "Trust, given without ceremony." "She is breathing," the paramedic confirmed, his voice calm, professional, the kind that steadied the air rather than disturbed it. "We will get her warmed and checked properly." Equipment appeared with quiet efficiency, blankets unfolded, instruments prepared, movements practiced but never rushed. Oliver stood at the edge of it all, his hands now empty, the absence of the child's weight suddenly noticeable, as though something had been taken not from him, but through him. He flexed his fingers slightly, grounding himself in the present, then glanced down at the dog. It had shifted closer to the woman again, not interfering, simply remaining, its body a constant line of quiet loyalty. "You stayed," Oliver said softly, almost without thinking, his voice low enough that only the dog might hear. The shepherd's ears flicked once, but it did not look up. It did not need recognition. It had done what it came to do. The paramedic with the baby turned slightly, meeting Oliver's gaze. "You found them?" she asked. Oliver hesitated for the briefest moment, then shook his head gently. "No," he replied, his eyes drifting back to the dog. "I was stopped." She followed his gaze, noticing the animal properly for the first time, her expression shifting from professional focus to something quieter, more reflective. "Right?" she said, a faint understanding settling in her tone, though she did not press further. There are moments when explanation is less important than outcome. The sounds of the morning grew stronger now, the world returning in layers, the distant hum of passing traffic beyond the bend, the rustle of wind through hedgerow branches, the faint warmth of sunlight beginning to press against the lingering chill. Time, which had felt suspended, began to move again. A stretcher was brought through the gap, placed carefully near the woman, movements coordinated, deliberate. She was lifted with care, supported, wrapped, her breathing monitored every step of the way. The dog rose as she was moved, stepping alongside for a moment, then pausing, as if understanding that this part no longer belonged to it. It watched, still and silent, as the woman was carried toward the waiting vehicle. Oliver found himself watching the dog more than anything else, drawn to the way it stood now, not tense, not anxious, but settled, as though something within it had eased. The paramedic carrying the baby moved past him, heading toward the ambulance, her arms steady, her focus unwavering. As she passed, the infant made a small sound, a breath that carried a little more strength than before, and Oliver felt a quiet relief move through him, not loud, not overwhelming, just present. He exhaled slowly, the air leaving his chest in a measured release. The doors of the ambulance opened, then closed again with a soft, final sound, sealing the warmth inside. The engine remained low, patient, waiting for the signal to move. Oliver turned his attention back to the field, to the space where everything had unfolded, and to the dog that remained. "They are safe now," he said quietly, his voice carrying a certainty that had not been there before. The shepherd lifted its head then, meeting his gaze once more, and for the first time since he had seen it, there was no urgency left in its eyes. Only stillness. Only calm. It held his gaze for a second, perhaps two, then did something unexpected. It stepped back, not away in fear, not retreating in uncertainty, but simply turning, as though its path lay elsewhere now. Oliver watched as it moved toward the hedgerow once more, slipping through the same narrow gap it had led him through, disappearing into the soft, fading mist beyond. No sound, no hesitation, just gone. He stood there for a moment longer, listening to the quiet it left behind, aware that something significant had passed through his life in the span of a single morning, something that would not ask to be followed or explained. Behind him, the ambulance engine rose slightly, preparing to depart, the world resuming its steady rhythm. Oliver turned slowly, his gaze lingering one last time on the space where the dog had been, then walked back toward the road, carrying with him the understanding that sometimes the most important voices are the ones that never speak at all. The ambulance pulled away with a steady, measured motion, its blue lights fading into the pale morning as it disappeared beyond the bend in the lane, leaving behind a quiet that felt different now, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but settled, as though something fragile had been carried safely out of reach. Oliver remained where he stood for a moment, the cool air brushing against his face, the faint warmth of the rising sun beginning to touch the edges of the hedgerow, turning the lingering mist into something softer, something that no longer concealed but revealed. He glanced down at his hands, still slightly cold, still remembering the weight they had held not long ago, and then slowly turned back toward his car, the door still open, the engine silent, waiting. Each step back onto the road felt heavier than it should have, not from exhaustion, but from the quiet shift inside him, the kind that does not announce itself but settles deep, changing the way things are understood. He paused beside the car, resting one hand on the roof, and looked once more toward the gap in the hedgerow where the dog had vanished. There was nothing there now but grass and light. The world returned to its ordinary shape, yet it did not feel ordinary anymore. "You knew," he said softly, not expecting an answer, not needing one. The words lingered in the air for a second before dissolving into the stillness. He closed the car door gently and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar interior grounding him in something steady, something known. The ignition turned, the engine came to life with a low hum, but he did not move straight away. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers loose, eyes unfocused for a brief moment as he replayed what had happened, not in sequence, but in feeling. The stillness of the dog, the weight of the child, the quiet presence of the woman in the grass. None of it demanded explanation. None of it needed to be solved. It had simply been what it was. After a few seconds, he exhaled slowly and guided the car forward, tires rolling gently over the damp surface as he made his way back along the narrow lane. The same road that had felt so ordinary less than an hour ago. The hedgerows passed by on either side, the fields beyond beginning to glow under the soft light of morning, the world waking fully now, unaware of the quiet miracle that had unfolded just out of sight. When he reached the main road, he slowed, glancing once in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement, a shadow, something that might suggest the dog had followed. But there was nothing. Only the empty stretch of lane behind him, fading into the distance. He turned onto the road and continued toward the village, the rhythm of driving returning, steady and familiar, yet carrying a new awareness with it. Time passed in quiet minutes, the kind that settled gently rather than rush, until the outline of the small hospital on the edge of town came into view. He had not planned to go there, not consciously, but his hands had guided him all the same. The car came to a stop in the modest car park, gravel crunching softly beneath the tires, and for a moment, he simply sat, watching as a nurse crossed the entrance with a clipboard, the ordinary flow of life continuing as it always did. He stepped out of the car and closed the door behind him, the sound firm but not loud, then made his way toward the entrance, each step measured, as though he were not entirely sure what he would say once inside. The doors opened automatically, warm air greeting him, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and early morning tea. He approached the reception desk, offering a small nod to the woman behind it. "There was an incident on Millbrook Lane," he said, voice calm, composed. "A woman and a child were brought in not long ago." The receptionist glanced at her screen, fingers moving quickly, then looked back up with a gentle, reassuring expression. "They arrived about 15 minutes ago," she confirmed. "Both are being looked after. The baby is stable, and the mother is receiving care. You did the right thing bringing attention to it." Oliver nodded once, the words settling into him with a quiet sense of relief, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just enough to ease something that had been held tight since the moment he first saw them. "Thank you," he replied softly. He turned to leave, pausing briefly near the doorway, his gaze drifting through the glass panels toward the outside world, now fully awake, the light stronger, clearer. People moved about their morning routines, unaware of how close something fragile had come to being lost, unaware of the silent intervention that had changed it. Oliver stepped back into the daylight, the cool air now touched with warmth, and stood there for a moment longer, looking out toward the road that led back to the fields. Somewhere beyond that stretch of land, beyond the hedgerow and the fading mist, a dog had made a choice without hesitation, without question, guided by something simple and unwavering. He breathed in slowly, then let it out, the air leaving him in a quiet release. There was nothing more to do, no answers to seek, no explanation to chase. Some things were not meant to be followed. They were meant to be witnessed, and then carried forward in the way a person chooses to see the world after. Oliver turned and walked back toward his car, the gravel shifting beneath his steps, the morning continuing as it always would. But within him, something had settled into place, something steady, something certain. Not all calls for help are heard with ears. Some are felt, and only those willing to stop will ever understand what they are being asked to see. The rest of the morning moved on as though nothing extraordinary had taken place, and yet Oliver carried it with him in the quiet spaces between ordinary moments, in the way his thoughts returned again and again to the same image of amber eyes holding steady in the dark. He drove without urgency, the roads gradually filling with the familiar rhythm of early commuters, cyclists passing in measured lines, shopkeepers lifting shutters with soft metallic rattles that echoed down narrow high streets. Everything felt the same, and yet not quite. He stopped once at a small cafe just off the square, more out of habit than hunger, and stood by the counter waiting for a cup of tea he did not particularly need. The warmth of the place wrapped around him, the scent of baked bread and fresh coffee filling the air, voices low and polite, the clink of porcelain against saucers steady and grounding. "Long morning?" the woman behind the counter asked, offering a faint, knowing smile. Oliver paused, considering the question for a moment longer than expected, then nodded lightly. "Something like that," he replied, his voice calm, though it carried a weight he could not quite place. He took the cup and moved to the window, watching the street beyond as people moved past with purpose, unaware of how close something fragile had come to being lost not far from where they walked. He thought of the baby, now warm, now held safely in careful hands, and of the woman, breathing steadily under watchful eyes. And then, without meaning to, his thoughts returned to the dog. Not where it had gone, but why it had done what it did. There had been no hesitation in its actions, no confusion, only certainty, as if the path it chose had never been in question. Oliver sipped his tea slowly, the warmth spreading through him, grounding him in the present. Yet his mind remained anchored somewhere between the field and the road, between instinct and understanding. After a while, he set the empty cup down and stepped back outside, the air now brighter, the sun lifting fully above the rooftops, casting long shadows that stretched and softened across the pavement. He returned to his car, pausing for just a second before opening the door, his gaze drifting once more toward the direction of the lane where it had all begun. There was no reason to go back, nothing left undone, and yet something in him lingered, not from doubt, but from a quiet pull that had not entirely faded. He sat behind the wheel, hands resting loosely, and let the engine idle for a moment before making a decision that did not feel like one at all. The road back to Millbrook Lane was familiar, the turns easy, the distance short, and within minutes he found himself slowing once more at the narrow stretch where the hedgerow stood. The lane looked unchanged, empty, still, as though it had not held anything more than morning fog and passing tires. He pulled over gently, the engine ticking as it settled into silence, and stepped out once again. The air was warmer now, the mist nearly gone, revealing the full shape of the fields beyond, stretching wide and quiet under the growing light. He walked toward the hedgerow, pushing gently through the same narrow gap, branches brushing softly against his jacket as he stepped into the field beyond. The grass had already begun to rise again where it had been flattened, the marks of earlier movement fading with the passage of time. He moved slowly, retracing his steps without effort, until he reached the spot where the woman had lain. There was nothing there now but the earth itself, calm and undisturbed, as though it had already begun to forget. Oliver stood still, hands at his sides, eyes scanning the space not in search of answers, but in quiet acknowledgement, letting the moment become something complete rather than something unfinished. And then, just as he turned to leave, there was a sound. Not loud, not sudden, a faint rustle from the edge of the hedgerow behind him. Oliver stopped, his breath stilling as he turned his head slightly, listening. The sound came again, subtle, deliberate. He did not move closer. He did not call out. He simply waited. And then, for the briefest moment, he saw it. A shape between the branches, partially hidden by shadow and light. The outline of a familiar form, still and watchful. The German shepherd stood just beyond the hedge, its body half concealed, its eyes catching the light in that same quiet, unwavering way. It did not step forward. It did not retreat. It simply looked at him. Oliver felt a small, unexpected smile touch the corner of his mouth, not wide, not obvious, but real. "They are safe," he said, his voice low, steady, carrying across the short distance without strain. The dog's ears flicked once, a subtle acknowledgement, before it shifted its weight slightly, as though preparing to move. For a second longer, they held each other's gaze, two lives crossing briefly in a way neither could fully explain. Then the dog turned, slipping back through the hedgerow, disappearing into the open field beyond without a sound, without hesitation, just as it had before. Oliver stood there for a moment after it was gone, the quiet returning around him, but it felt different now, complete in a way it had not been earlier. He nodded once, more to himself than anything else, then turned and made his way back through the hedge, stepping once more onto the lane. The world continued, unchanged and yet subtly altered, and as he returned to his car, one thought settled clearly in his mind, simple and certain. Some bonds are not meant to last. They are meant to appear exactly when they are needed, to guide, to save, and then to fade, leaving behind something stronger than presence, something that stays. The day carried on, but it no longer felt like a day that belonged entirely to him. There was a quiet shift in the way Oliver moved through it, as though part of him had been left behind in that field, standing beside a moment that refused to fade in the ordinary way memories often do. Hours passed in small, unnoticed increments. He returned home, went through motions that had once felt automatic, set his keys down in the same place, hung his jacket without thinking, and yet each action seemed to echo slightly differently, as though the space itself had changed shape around him. The house was still, the kind of stillness that usually offered comfort, but today it carried a trace of something else, something reflective, something that asked him to sit with it rather than move past it. He stood for a moment in the center of the room, hands resting loosely at his sides, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, each second marking time in a way that felt more deliberate than before. His thoughts drifted, not in a rush, but in quiet returns to the same images. The road, the dog, the way it had waited, not for any car, but for the right one. He moved toward the window and looked out across the street, where the world continued with its usual rhythm, neighbors passing by, a cyclist gliding along the pavement, a delivery van stopping briefly before moving on. Everything carried on, unchanged, and yet he could not quite see it the same way. "You chose," he said softly, not to anyone present, but to the memory itself. The idea settled deeper the more he considered it. The dog had not acted randomly. It had not been driven by panic or confusion. It had chosen a moment, a place, and a person. And for reasons Oliver could not fully explain, that person had been him. He let out a slow breath, the air leaving him with a quiet steadiness, then stepped away from the window, moving toward the small table near the doorway where he kept a few personal things. Among them lay an old photograph, slightly worn at the edges, its surface softened by time. He picked it up without hesitation, his thumb brushing lightly across the image. It showed a younger version of himself, standing beside another figure, both of them in uniform, shoulders squared, expressions calm but alert, and at their feet, a dog. Not the same one, but similar. The memory rose gently, not sharp, not painful, just present. He had not thought of that time in a while, not in detail. Life had a way of moving forward, of placing distance between what was and what is. But now, standing there with the photograph in his hand, he felt that distance close slightly, not fully, but enough to recognize something familiar in what he had witnessed that morning. Loyalty. Not loud, not declared, simply lived. He set the photograph back down carefully, the gesture deliberate, then ran a hand lightly over his face, grounding himself once more in the present. The day stretched ahead, ordinary in its structure, but no longer empty in its meaning. Later, as the afternoon settled into a softer light, Oliver found himself back outside, walking without a fixed destination, his steps guided more by thought than intention. The streets gave way to quieter paths, and before long he was near the edge of the village again, where the open land began and the sounds of daily life softened into something more distant. He did not plan to return to the exact place. He did not need to. But something in the air, in the openness of the fields, felt closer to what he had experienced. He walked along the edge of a low fence, his gaze drifting across the wide stretch of land, the grass moving gently under the touch of a mild breeze. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting longer shadows now, the light warmer, more forgiving. It was then, in that quiet, unplanned moment, that he noticed something small. Not movement, not a figure, but a mark. Near the base of the fence, partially hidden by the grass, lay a narrow strip of worn fabric. He approached slowly, crouching slightly to get a clearer view. It was part of a collar, frayed at the edges, faded with time, but unmistakable in its purpose. Oliver reached down and picked it up gently, turning it over in his hand. There was no tag, no name, nothing to identify who it belonged to. And yet, as he held it, something settled quietly in his chest, a sense of connection not built on certainty, but on understanding. The dog he had seen that morning had worn no collar, no mark of ownership, and perhaps that had been the point. Some guardians do not belong to anyone. They belong to the moment that calls them. Oliver stood slowly, the piece of fabric still in his hand, and looked out across the field once more. There was no sign of movement, no figure watching from the distance, only the open land, stretching wide under the soft light of evening. He closed his hand gently around the collar and slipped it into his pocket, not as something to keep, but as something to remember. A quiet token of something that did not ask to be held onto, but simply acknowledged. As he turned to walk back toward the village, his steps steady and unhurried, one thought remained with him, clear and certain in its simplicity. Not every act of rescue ends with a reunion. Some end with understanding. And sometimes that is enough. Evening settled slowly over the village, not with sudden darkness, but with a gentle dimming of light that softened edges and quieted movement, the kind of transition that invites reflection rather than demands attention. Oliver walked with an unhurried pace, the worn strip of collar resting in his pocket, its presence subtle but constant, like a thought that refused to leave entirely. The sky above stretched wide in muted tones of gold and pale blue, clouds drifting in slow, deliberate patterns as if time itself had decided to ease its pace for a while. He passed familiar places without really seeing them, his mind still anchored to the field, to the silent understanding that had passed between him and something that did not need words to be understood. When he reached his home again, the door closed behind him with a quiet finality, sealing out the last of the daylight. Inside, the room carried a softer stillness now, one that felt less empty and more complete, as though something unseen had found its place within it. He moved to the small table near the doorway and took the strip of collar from his pocket, placing it gently beside the photograph he had looked at earlier. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the two objects, one from the past, one from the present, both connected by something that did not need to be named. His fingers brushed lightly against the fabric, feeling its worn texture, the edges softened by time and use. "You were not lost," he said quietly, his voice low, almost thoughtful. "You were sent." The words lingered in the air, not as a conclusion, but as a quiet possibility. He turned away then, moving deeper into the house, switching on a single lamp that cast a warm, steady glow across the room, leaving the corners in soft shadow. Outside, the last light of day faded fully, giving way to the calm presence of night, the world slowing, settling, breathing in a different rhythm. Hours passed without urgency. Oliver sat for a while, not reading, not watching anything in particular, simply existing in the quiet, letting his thoughts move where they needed to go. The events of the morning no longer felt sharp or urgent. They had softened into something steadier, something that did not press for explanation but offered understanding instead. At some point, he rose and stepped outside once more, drawn by the stillness that only comes when the world has fully settled into night. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant fields, the sky above clear and scattered with stars that seemed brighter away from the noise of the day. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, listening to the quiet. And then, just at the edge of hearing, there was a sound. Not a bark, not a call, something softer. A movement through grass, perhaps, or the shifting of leaves against one another. Oliver did not turn immediately. He did not step forward. He simply listened, allowing the sound to exist without chasing it. After a few seconds, he glanced toward the edge of the garden, where the darkness met the faint outline of the open land beyond. There was no clear shape, no figure standing in the open. And yet, something in the way the shadows held themselves suggested presence rather than absence. He felt no alarm, no tension, only a quiet recognition. "You do not stay," he said softly, his voice steady in the cool air. "You just make sure others can." The words seemed to settle into the night, carried gently by the breeze, not answered, not denied, simply accepted. The faint sound came once more, then faded, leaving the space as it had been before, still and undisturbed. Oliver remained there for a moment longer, his gaze resting on the darkness, not searching, not expecting, simply acknowledging. Then he turned back toward the house, stepping inside and closing the door behind him, the quiet returning fully, uninterrupted. Before he moved further, his eyes drifted once more to the table near the doorway. The strip of collar lay beside the photograph, both objects now resting in the same soft light, connected by something deeper than time or circumstance. He approached slowly, reaching out to adjust the fabric slightly, placing it more deliberately, as though giving it a place rather than leaving it by chance. His hand lingered there for a second, then withdrew. "Some stories do not stay where they begin," he murmured, his voice low, almost reflective. "They move through us." The room held the words without echo, without judgment, simply allowing them to exist. Oliver stepped back, taking one last look before turning away, the quiet of the night settling around him like a gentle conclusion. Outside, beyond the walls of the house, beyond the boundaries of the village, the fields stretched wide and open under the stars, and somewhere within that vast, silent space, a presence moved without needing to be seen, without needing to be known. Without haste, the sound of the kettle, the quiet clink of a cup placed on the table, each action carrying a steadiness that did not require thought. When he reached for his keys, his gaze paused, drawn once more to the small table near the doorway. The strip of collar lay beside the photograph, exactly where he had placed it, but this morning it seemed less like an object and more like a marker, a quiet reminder that something unseen had passed through his life and left a trace that would not fade easily. He picked it up again, turning it lightly between his fingers, noticing details he had not seen before, the faint stitching along one edge, the subtle curve where it had once rested against something living, something moving. "You stayed long enough," he said softly, the words carrying no question, only acknowledgement. He slipped it back into his pocket, not out of habit, but out of intention, as though it belonged with him now, at least for a while. Outside, the village moved into the day with its usual quiet purpose, doors opening, voices exchanging greetings, the ordinary flow of life resuming its steady pace. Oliver stepped into it without resistance, yet he carried something with him that set him slightly apart, not visibly, not in any way others would notice, but in the way he saw things, in the way he listened. He drove without aim at first, letting the road decide the direction, the gentle curves leading him through familiar stretches of countryside, where fields opened wide, and the sky seemed to stretch further than it had the day before. He passed the turn toward Millbrook Lane without stopping this time, not because he avoided it, but because he no longer needed to return. What had been there had already found its place. Instead, he continued onward, following a quieter road that led toward a small village on the far side of the fields, one he had not visited in some time. The journey was unremarkable in its details, yet it carried a quiet sense of purpose, as though each mile added something subtle to the understanding that had begun to take shape. When he arrived, he parked near a small green bordered by low stone walls and stepped out into the soft morning air. The village was quieter than his own, its pace slower, its presence more still, the kind of place where time seemed to fold in on itself rather than move forward. He walked without direction, past a row of cottages with ivy climbing gently along their walls, past a small church whose doors stood slightly ajar, inviting rather than imposing. There was no reason for him to be here, and yet it felt right in a way that did not need explanation. As he reached the edge of the green, he noticed an older man seated on a bench, his posture relaxed, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. Oliver slowed his pace, not intending to interrupt, but the man glanced toward him with a quiet nod, an acknowledgement that required no words. Oliver returned the gesture and might have continued on, but something made him pause. "Do you ever get the feeling," he said after a moment, his voice measured, thoughtful, "that some things find you rather than the other way round?" The man did not answer immediately. He shifted slightly, considering the question with the patience of someone who did not rush to fill silence. Then, after a few seconds, he gave a small, knowing smile. "Only when they need to," he replied, his tone calm, as though stating something simple and obvious. Oliver felt the words settle into him with a quiet certainty, not as something new, but as something recognized. He nodded once, more to himself than to the man, and continued walking, the conversation ending as naturally as it had begun. The village remained still behind him as he made his way back toward the car, the sky above clear, the lights steady and unchanging. When he reached the door, he paused once more, his hand resting lightly against the handle, his thoughts returning, not in confusion, but in quiet clarity. The road, the child, the woman, the dog. None of it asked to be understood fully. It had only asked to be seen, and to be answered in the moment it unfolded. He opened the car door and slid inside, the familiar space grounding him once more, but this time it did not feel like a return to something ordinary. It felt like a continuation. As the engine started and the car moved forward, he did not look back. There was no need. Some moments do not belong to the past. They move with you, shaping the way you recognize what matters when it appears again. And somewhere, beyond the reach of roads and names, beyond the quiet boundaries of fields and hedgerows, a presence continued its path, unseen but certain, answering calls that were never spoken aloud, arriving exactly when it was needed, and leaving just as quietly when it was done. And Oliver, without needing to say it again, understood that if such a moment ever found him once more, he would stop. He would listen, and he would follow. The road stretched ahead in a quiet line of pale gray, bordered by fields that seemed to breathe with the wind, each blade of grass shifting in a rhythm too gentle to notice unless you chose to slow down and watch. Oliver drove without urgency, his hands steady on the wheel, his eyes not just seeing but observing in a way they had not before, as though something in him had learned to recognize the subtle signals the world offered when it needed to be heard. The village behind him faded into distance, replaced by open land and long horizons that carried no distractions, only space to think and to feel without interruption. He passed a narrow bridge where a small stream moved beneath it, the water catching the light in soft fragments. And for a moment he slowed, not because he needed to, but because something about the quiet movement below reminded him of the way life continued beneath the surface of things, unseen but constant. He did not stop, not this time, but he noticed. And that, he realized, was the difference. Further along, the road curved gently, leading him past a cluster of trees that stood slightly apart from the rest, their branches swaying with a calm resilience that spoke of time rather than change. As he passed them, a thought returned, not as a question, but as a quiet understanding. Not everything that appears in your life is meant to stay. Some things arrive only to guide you towards something else, and once that path is clear, they move on without asking to be followed. Oliver's gaze softened slightly as he continued driving, the rhythm of the journey settling into something almost meditative. The hum of the engine, the steady roll of tires against the road, the distant call of birds carried faintly through the open window, all of it blending into a quiet harmony that asked nothing from him but presence. After some time, he found himself nearing the outskirts of another small settlement, one he did not recognize immediately, its houses spaced further apart, its roads narrower, its presence quieter still. He slowed as he entered, more out of instinct than necessity, his attention drawn to the subtle details that marked the place as lived in but not hurried. A bicycle leaned against a low stone wall, its paint slightly worn but cared for. A small garden stood beside a cottage, its flowers arranged not for show but for comfort. Everything here seemed to exist with intention, without excess. He parked near a small open space where a few benches faced outward toward a wide stretch of land, the kind of place where people came not to pass time, but to sit with it. He stepped out of the car and closed the door quietly, the sound absorbed almost immediately by the open air. For a moment, he simply stood there, feeling the stillness settle around him, not empty, but full in a way that did not need explanation. Then he walked slowly toward one of the benches and sat down, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. The view before him stretched far, fields rolling gently into the distance, the horizon soft and unbroken, the sky above vast and steady. He sat there for a while, not counting the minutes, not measuring the time, simply allowing himself to be present in a way that did not demand thought or action. And then, without warning, a memory surfaced. Not from that morning, but from something older, something quieter, something that had not seemed important at the time. He was younger then, standing at the edge of a training ground, watching as a handler worked with a dog not unlike the one he had seen. The precision, the trust, the way the animal moved not because it was told, but because it understood. At the time, it had seemed like discipline. Now it felt like something else. Entirely. Something deeper. Something that could not be trained, only recognized. Oliver let the memory pass without holding on to it, allowing it to settle into the same quiet space as everything else. He reached into his pocket then, his fingers brushing against the worn strip of collar, and for a moment he considered taking it out. But he did not. Instead, he left it where it was, understanding that its presence did not need to be seen to be felt. A light breeze moved across the field, brushing against his face, carrying with it the faint scent of grass and earth, grounding him in the present once more. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a quiet sense of clarity. Somewhere, beyond the visible stretch of land, beyond the places he could reach or name, something continued its path, unseen but certain, responding to needs that were not spoken, guided by something that did not require explanation. And for the first time since that morning, Oliver did not wonder where it was, or where it would go next. He simply accepted that it existed, that it acted, and that it would appear again, somewhere, for someone, exactly when it was needed. He rose from the bench after a while, not because he had to, but because the moment felt complete. His steps were steady as he returned to the car, his movements unhurried, his mind no longer searching for answers, but holding on to something quieter, something more enduring. As he opened the door and stepped inside, he paused for just a second, his hand resting lightly on the frame, his gaze drifting once more across the open field. There was nothing there to see, no figure, no movement, and yet, something in the stillness felt familiar, not in presence, but in meaning. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, then settled into the seat and started the engine. The car moved forward, rejoining the road, carrying him onward into the quiet continuation of the day. And as the distance grew between him and that place, one understanding remained, clear and steady, not loud, not demanding, but certain in its truth. Sometimes, the most important guides in our lives do not walk beside us for long. They simply show us where to go, and trust that we will remember how to listen when the moment comes again. The afternoon stretched into evening once more, but this time it carried a different weight, not heavy, not uncertain, but quietly settled, as though something within the day had reached its natural conclusion and was now ready to rest. Oliver drove with a steadiness that came not from routine, but from understanding, his hands guiding the wheel with an ease that reflected the calm within him. The roads no longer felt like paths to somewhere else, but part of a wider rhythm he had stepped into, one that did not rush, did not demand, but simply moved forward in quiet continuity. As he approached the familiar outline of his own village again, the soft glow of early evening lights began to appear in windows, small points of warmth against the fading sky. He slowed slightly, not out of necessity, but out of awareness, noticing details that might once have passed unnoticed. The way a curtain shifted gently in an open window, the faint laughter of voices carried from a nearby garden, the subtle presence of life continuing in its many small forms. When he pulled into his drive, the engine settled into silence once more, the quiet returning with a sense of completion rather than pause. He stepped out of the car and stood for a moment, looking up at the sky as the last light of day gave way to the deeper tones of evening. There was a stillness there, not empty, but full in a way that did not need explanation. He moved inside without hurry, the door closing softly behind him, the house welcoming him back with a familiarity that now felt deeper than before. The small table near the doorway remained as he had left it, the photograph and the strip of collar resting side by side, unchanged yet somehow more meaningful. He approached it slowly, his gaze settling on the objects with a quiet recognition. There was no need to pick them up this time. No need to examine them again. Their presence was enough. He turned away and moved further into the house, switching on a lamp that cast a warm, steady light across the room, softening the edges of everything it touched. The evening unfolded in simple, unremarkable ways. He prepared a meal, sat at the table, ate without distraction, each action carried out with a calm that did not seek to fill silence, but to exist within it. The events of the day did not demand to be replayed. They no longer pressed at the edges of his thoughts. Instead, they rested quietly, integrated into something deeper, something that did not need to be revisited in detail to be understood. After some time, he stood and moved once more toward the window, looking out into the darkness that had now settled fully across the street. The world beyond was quieter, slower, the movement of earlier hours replaced by the occasional passing car, the distant glow of streetlights marking the shape of the road. He rested his hand lightly against the frame, his gaze steady, his thoughts clear. "It was never about chance," he said softly, the words forming not as a question, but as a conclusion. The stillness beyond the glass held the words without response, yet something in the quiet seemed to acknowledge them, not with sound, but with presence. He remained there for a moment longer, then stepped back, allowing the night to settle fully into the space around him. Later, as the hours deepened and the house grew still, Oliver found himself returning once more to the doorway, not out of restlessness, but out of a quiet instinct that guided him there. He stood before the small table, his gaze moving between the photograph and the strip of collar, the connection between them now fully understood without needing to be explained. He reached out slowly, his fingers brushing against the fabric, then lifting it gently. It felt lighter than before, not in weight, but in meaning, as though whatever purpose it had carried had now been fulfilled. He held it for a moment, then set it back down, not as something to keep, but as something to honor. "You did not need to stay," he said quietly, his voice calm, steady. "You only needed to be there." The words settled into the room, not echoing, not lingering, simply becoming part of the space they were spoken into. He turned away then, moving toward the center of the room, his steps unhurried, his posture relaxed, the tension that had once existed now fully gone. The night carried on outside, steady and unchanged, the world continuing in its quiet rhythm, unaware of the shift that had taken place within one man's understanding of it. And yet, somewhere beyond the reach of light and sound, beyond the boundaries of roads and names, something continued its path, unseen but certain, guided by a purpose that did not seek recognition, only completion. Oliver moved through the final moments of the evening without thought, preparing to rest, allowing the day to close in the way it had unfolded, with quiet certainty, without need for resolution. And as he lay down, the last thought that passed through his mind was not of what had happened, but of what it meant, not as a question, but as something already answered. Some moments do not arrive to change the world. They arrive to change the way we see it. And once that shift has taken place, everything that follows carries a different kind of light, one that does not fade, even in the quiet of night. The night gave way to morning once more, but this time it arrived with a quiet sense of closure, as though the world itself had turned a page without needing to announce it. Light filtered slowly through the curtains, soft and patient, settling across the room in a way that felt less like the start of something new and more like the continuation of something already understood. Oliver woke without urgency, his mind clear, his breath steady, the weight that had once lingered now replaced by something lighter, something resolved. He lay still for a moment, listening to the subtle sounds of the house, the faint creak of wood adjusting to temperature, the distant hum of life beginning again outside, all of it familiar, yet touched by a quiet clarity that had not been there before. When he rose, his movements were unhurried, deliberate without effort, as though each action now carried meaning simply by being noticed. He moved through the morning routine with the same calm presence, the kettle warming, the cup resting in his hands, the steam rising gently into the air. There was no need to revisit the past, no need to replay the moment. That had changed something within him. It was already part of him now, settled into place like something that had always been waiting to be understood. As he stepped toward the doorway, his gaze naturally found the small table once more. The photograph remained, unchanged, its edges worn but steady. Beside it, the strip of collar lay where he had left it, but this morning it seemed different. Not as a reminder, not as a question, but as something complete. He reached out and picked it up one last time, holding it lightly between his fingers, feeling its texture without searching for anything more within it. "You were never meant to stay," he said quietly, his voice calm, certain. only to guide. The words did not linger. They did not echo. They simply existed, then settled into silence, as though they had found their place without resistance. He looked at the photograph beside it, the younger version of himself standing beside another life, another moment, another kind of loyalty. For the first time, the two no longer felt separate. They were part of the same thread, woven through different times, different places, but carrying the same quiet truth. Oliver placed the strip of collar back down, not with hesitation, but with intention, aligning it gently beside the photograph as though giving it a place rather than leaving it by chance. Then he stepped back, his gaze resting on the table for a moment longer before turning away. Outside, the morning had fully settled, the sky clear, the air crisp but gentle, the kind of day that did not demand attention but offered itself quietly to those willing to notice it. He stepped beyond the doorway, closing the door behind him with a soft, final sound that marked not an ending, but a transition. The street carried its usual rhythm, people moving through their routines, cars passing with quiet purpose, the world continuing as it always had. And yet, within that continuity, Oliver felt no separation. He was part of it in a way that felt more connected than before, not because anything around him had changed, but because the way he saw it had. He walked without a destination, his steps guided by nothing more than presence. The path unfolding beneath him without needing to be chosen. As he reached the edge of the village, where the road opened once more toward the fields, he paused briefly, his gaze drifting across the wide stretch of land that had held the moment that now lived quietly within him. There was nothing there to see, no trace, no sign, only the openness of space and the gentle movement of wind through grass. And yet, he did not feel the need to search. He did not feel the pull to return. What had happened there no longer belonged to that place. It had moved with him, become part of something he would carry forward without effort. He stood for a moment longer, the breeze brushing lightly against him, the air carrying the faint scent of earth and distance, grounding him in the present. Then he nodded once, a small gesture, not to anything visible, but to the understanding itself. "I will remember," he said softly, his voice steady, not as a promise, but as a truth already in motion. The moment passed, as all moments do, but it did not fade. It settled, deep and quiet, becoming something that did not need to be revisited to remain real. Oliver turned and began to walk again, his steps steady, his path open, the day unfolding ahead without urgency, without expectation. And somewhere, beyond the reach of sight and sound, beyond the boundaries of roads and fields, something continued its quiet work, unseen, unrecognized, but never absent. Not as a presence to be followed, but as a reminder of what is possible when instinct meets trust, when silence is heard, and when a single moment is enough to change the way a life is lived. And in that understanding, there was no need for more. No need for answers, no need for return. Only the quiet certainty that what had been given had been enough, and that in its simplicity, it would remain. There are moments in a life that do not arrive with noise or warning, moments that do not ask to be remembered and yet refuse to be forgotten. And this had become one of them, not because of what was seen, but because of what was understood. The days that followed did not change in any visible way. The village continued as it always had, mornings opened with quiet routine, evenings settled with the same gentle rhythm. And yet within Oliver something had shifted into a steadier alignment, something that did not seek meaning anymore, because it had already found it. He moved through his days with a quieter attention, noticing the small pauses between things, the space where instinct lived before thought interrupted it. A door held open a second longer, a glance given where before there would have been none, a moment of stillness chosen instead of urgency. These were not changes anyone else would see, but they were real in the only way that mattered. One afternoon, some days later, he found himself once more near the edge of the village, not drawn there by memory, but by a quiet familiarity that no longer needed reason. The fields stretched wide under a sky washed in pale blue, the wind moving gently through the grass, carrying with it that same scent of earth and distance that had marked the beginning of everything. He stood there for a while, hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze steady, not searching, not expecting, simply present. There was no sign of anything unusual, no trace of what had once unfolded in that place, and yet it did not feel empty. It felt complete, as though the moment had not disappeared, but had been absorbed into something larger than the space it had occupied. Oliver exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a calm that no longer came from understanding, but from acceptance. "That was enough," he said quietly, his voice steady against the open air. Not a question, not a reflection, a truth. The wind carried the words lightly, dispersing them into the vastness beyond, and for a brief second, something shifted. Not in the field, not in the sky, but within him. The need to look back dissolved completely, replaced by something simpler, something more enduring. The willingness to look forward without fear of missing what had already been given. He turned then, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty, his steps leading him back toward the path that carried him home. Each movement felt lighter, not because the past had been left behind, but because it no longer needed to be carried as something separate. It had become part of the way he walked, the way he paused, the way he chose. As he reached the road, the world resumed its quiet motion around him, a car passing in the distance, a figure walking a dog along the far hedge, the small, ordinary patterns of life continuing without interruption. And yet, in those ordinary moments, something deeper remained, something that did not announce itself, but revealed itself only to those who had learned how to notice. Oliver paused once more before stepping fully onto the road, his gaze drifting across the landscape one final time, not searching for a figure, not hoping for a return, but acknowledging what had been. Somewhere beyond what could be seen, beyond the reach of roads and memory, something continued its quiet work, answering needs that would never be spoken aloud, arriving without recognition, leaving without expectation. Not lost, not alone, simply present where it was needed most. He nodded once, a small gesture, almost imperceptible, then stepped forward, rejoining the path that belonged to him. The day carried on, the lights steady, the air calm, the world unchanged in all the ways that could be measured. But within that quiet continuation, something had been restored. Not belief in something distant or abstract, but trust in something immediate and real. The understanding that even in the most ordinary places, even in the quietest moments, there are forces at work that do not seek attention, only action. That sometimes, the smallest interruption is not a delay, but a direction. And that listening, truly listening, can mean the difference between passing by and becoming part of something greater than yourself. Oliver walked on, his pace steady, his path clear, no longer guided by questions, but by something quieter, something that did not need to be explained to be followed. And as the distance grew between him and the field, between him and that single, impossible moment, it did not feel like leaving. It felt like carrying forward. Because some stories do not end where they seem to. They continue in the way a person chooses to see the world after they have been changed by it. And in that quiet continuation, there is a kind of grace that does not need to be named, only lived.